I think we're going to get started just in the interest of time. As we've all seen, if we start late and we try to end on time, we're incredibly unfair to our panelists, but also to our audience that's interested in participating in the question and answer session. So we'll get started, and hopefully any folks will come in as we go. Hopefully people will dribble in as I'm speaking so no one will miss our panelists. So good afternoon. My name is Asli Bâli. I teach international law here at UCLA, and I'm an affiliated faculty member of the Critical Race Studies program. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's plenary session of the 5th Annual CRS Symposium at the UCLA School of Law. I'm sure you'll all agree with me when I say that we've had an extraordinary and, of course, continuing day of conversation, both in the plenary sessions and the concurrent workshops, that have enabled our discussions to take place in large and intimate settings and at multiple levels of engagement. This afternoon's session, titled Sovereigns and Subjects, turns our attention to the ways in which sovereign power defines its subjects, as well as the conditions on which they are accorded rights or denied rights. Sovereignty may, on the one hand, represent an assertion of popular self-determination. On the other hand, domination may occur through assertions of sovereignty in contravention of another group or people's claims or rights. That is, affirmative assertions of sovereignty often entail forms of erasure and denials of sovereignty. By rejecting the formal incorporation or by refusing to recognize the independent sovereign status of others, those who assert sovereignty often also silence it. Further, strategies of exclusion of certain sovereignty claims are frequently a mechanism for legal rights avoidance. This panel will consider the relationship between sovereigns and subjects, with a particular emphasis on how sovereigns have subordinated specific populations using combined strategies of exclusion, inclusion, and non-recognition. Our discussion this afternoon will thus recenter our attention on the simultaneously constitutive and repressive implications of sovereignty. A brief list of questions that arise as we consider the ways in which the meaning of sovereignty is fraught include the following. First, how have strategies of inclusion, exclusion, and non-recognition worked to subordinate the rights claims of particular groups? Second, what forms of agency have indigenous, immigrant, and/or minority groups developed in resistance to these subordination strategies, particularly through assertions of alternative narratives of sovereignty? And third, what are the possibilities and limits of a reconceptualization of sovereignty as a mechanism to resist international and domestic pressures on indigenous, immigrant, and/or minority communities? Fortunately, we have an amazing panel of insightful academics and advocates for our plenary session this afternoon who will help us navigate these questions and think through the many opportunities and challenges in some of the most important sites for critical intersectional scholarship on sovereignty, indigeneity, immigration, and race in the world today, drawing their insights from work on the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Hawaii, Mexico, South Africa, the Middle East, and beyond, as well as the challenges facing immigrant and minority communities here in the United States. It is my great honor to introduce, in the order they will be speaking, our distinguished panelists for the afternoon. Our starting point will be a discussion of post-raciality as a modality by which sovereign power seeks to consolidate and cohere itself. This presentation will be by David Theo Goldberg, who is the director of the University of California Humanities Research Institute, the University of California system-wide research facility for the human sciences and theoretical research in the arts. Professor Goldberg's work ranges over issues of political theory, race and racism, ethics, law and society, critical theory, cultural studies, and increasingly, digital humanities. He has authored numerous publications, and most recently, with Professor Kathy Davidson, the book, The Future of Thinking, Learning Institutions in a Digital Age, which is forthcoming from MIT Press. Professor Goldberg's other books include The Threat of Race, The Racial State, Racial Subjects, Writing on Race in America, Racist Culture, Philosophy and the Politics of Meaning, and Ethical Theory and Social Issues, Historical Texts and Contemporary Readings. Professor Gil Gott, our next speaker, will engage the question of sovereignty and subject formation through the prism of the racialization of Middle Easterners, South Asians, and Muslims in the war on terror context in the United States, where sovereignty is expressed through prerogatives of national security and racialized subjects are produced through both repressive state practice and a praxis of resistance on the part of the subject communities. Professor Gott is the Associate Professor of the International Studies Department at DePaul University. His scholarly interests include international law and global social justice, social movements, critical media studies, critical race theory, and critical security studies. Recently, Professor Gott authored with Sumi Cho, The Racial Sovereign in Sovereignty, Emergency, Legality. His other work includes The Devil We Know, Racial Subordination and National Security Law, Imperial Humanitarianism, History of an Arrested Dialectic, and Identity and Crisis, The Critical Race Project, and Postmodern Political Theory, among others. Following next will be Professor Leti Volpp, who will discuss the relationship of immigration to indigenous sovereignty, and particularly the erasure of indigeneity as the settler colonial sovereign disappears natives to impose its own legal regime of inclusion and exclusion in the form of immigration laws. Professor Volpp is a professor of law at the Bolt Law School at the University of California at Berkeley. She writes about citizenship, migration, culture, and identity. Her most recent publications include the edited volume Legal Borderlands, Law and the Construction of American Borders, in addition to The Culture of Citizenship and Disappearing Acts on Gendered Violence, Pathological Cultures, and Civil Society. Professor Volpp's numerous honors include 2 Rockefeller Foundation Humanities Fellowships, a MacArthur Foundation Individual Research and Writing Grant, and the Association of American Law Schools Minority Section Derek A. Bell Jr. Award. Our penultimate panelist, Maylei Blackwell, will discuss the ways in which liberal sovereigns seek to co-opt human rights framings to deny indigenous rights and seek to erase the agency of indigenous social movements, drawing on a Mexican case study. In that case study, she examines ways in which the Mexican state has used a gendered, cultural logic of racism that co-opts women's rights in its arguments against indigenous autonomy. Professor Blackwell is an interdisciplinary scholar, activist, and oral historian. She is currently a faculty member in the UCLA Cesar Chavez Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies and Women's Studies, and is affiliated faculty in the American Indian Studies and GLBT Studies programs. Professor Blackwell works with indigenous women's organizers in Mexico, Latin American feminist movements, and sexual rights activists, all of whom are involved in cross-border organizing and community formation. Her most recent research projects with farm worker women and indigenous migrants seek to better understand new forms of grassroots transnationalism. Her forthcoming book, entitled Retrofitted Memory, Contested Histories of Gender and Feminism in the Chicano Movement, focuses on early Chicana feminism. Finally, last but not least, Maivan Lam will offer a genealogical account of the development of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, building on that account to discuss indigeneity as a resource for the rediscovery and or construction of a norm of connectedness in the international system that might enable resistance to the dismembering pressures of other mechanisms of globalization and global capital. Professor Lam is Emeritus Professor of International Studies and is a former Associate Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. She has taught courses in public international law, international environmental law, and the rights of indigenous peoples under U.S. and international law. She also serves as the International Law Advisor to the American Indian Law Alliance, which was the leading NGO participant in the decades-long process of drafting the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Her academic work is at the intersection of law and anthropology, with a focus on indigenous women's issues, and includes such recent articles as Remembering the Country of Their Birth, Indigenous Peoples and Territoriality, and Between Nationalism and Feminism, Indigenous Women, Community, and State. What remains for me is the very, very difficult task of holding our panelists to about 10 minutes each in their opening presentations, following which I hope to pose an initial set of questions after the opening and then turn it over to the audience and have your participation in closing out the panel. So please join me in welcoming our panelists as I turn the floor over to Professor Goldberg.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure being here. I want to add my voice of thanks to being invited to speak to you this afternoon, and it's a pleasure to see old friends and to make new colleagues. We're on Zoom time, so I'm going to zoom through some of this, right, by reading a good deal of it. But I want to begin just by highlighting some of the senses of sovereignty that have been floating around since yesterday evening. Devin Cabado started out by sort of noting sovereignty as a claim about self-determination. That seems to have been repeated over time. This morning, Audra Simpson, in her forceful presentation, invoked an Arendtian conception of the right to rights as a form of the sovereign. And on the same panel, Chris Anderson spoke of sovereignty as a power, the Foucauldian power over making live and letting die, and again Audra Simpson of a kind of racially marked or driven death. I want to add to this, complicate it a bit, as a presumption on which my read remarks will be predicated, the Schmittian conception of sovereignty, which has not been explicitly expressed, at least in the public panels, the Schmittian conception of the right, which includes the power to decide the state of exception, which is not just a state of emergency, but really to define the conditions of possibility over who gets to live and who gets to die. And that notion of decision and of the power of that ultimate decision looms very large. In this sense, I want to say, even as sovereignty in this latter Schmittian sense seems to be pushed all over the place these days, that sovereignty has become more diffuse, fractured, increasingly, you might say, incoherent, a point to which I want to return in conclusion. As a mode of governance, in the face of this diffusion and fracturing, the assertion of sovereign power has tended to stress heterogeneity as commercial and social emphasis, and violence where that heterogeneity, that idealized, romanticized heterogeneity seems to break down, where heterogeneity and mixture have tended to break down to prevailing in its prevailing reach to the orders of containability. And I want to suggest that the conception of post-raciality about which I'm about to speak, in this conception of things, becomes an attempt to cohere this breaking down, so to speak. It's a prevailing mode, I want to say even the principal strategy by which the reach to extend and consolidate sovereign power in what one might simply mark as a kind of neoliberal order is materialized. Sovereign power is materialized. Post-raciality, in short, is a fabrication of the racial condition of the moment, a dominant expression of contemporary neoliberal racial formation. So in this sense, post-raciality is not simply an extension of mid-20th century colorblindness, though it's that. I want to say it's an extension of a much longer trajectory that I mark a century older, back to the middle of the 19th century as the emergence or the increasing dominance of what I call racial historicism, which in short is a historical immaturity claim rather than the naturalized inferiority claim. So post-raciality, I'm saying, is an extension of that century and a half trajectory of racial historicism. So how, in this sense, does the post-racial operate here? The post-racial empties out the conventional racial of its classic meanings, at once opening the racial in its empty silences to be filled with any meanings chosen, at hand, fabricated. The filling becomes a fulfilling of prophecy, prediction of what is defined. What is divine, not defined, what is divine, always already known, about history, personality, productivity, national character, in a sense you might say even national personality. They're not ready for democracy. I mean, that notion of racial historicism then returning over here. I think of Glenn Beck's history lessons as doing just this, right? It's a kind of post-raciality in this sense is a kind of pure political theology. The racial silent, the silently racial, its ghostly presence burying alive racial histories, is the perfect medium for what I call make-believe, of compelling belief in the unbelievable. The unseen truth, inscribed yet again in socialities of the skin, now presumed without naming because they no longer have to, if they can be at all, they no longer have to be, if they can be at all, evidenced experientially as communities of experience, of common sense, but lacking independent warrant, asserted shamelessly because absent the apparent cover of classic racial terms. Post-raciality then operates by deflection from attending to racial disparity. Invisible man becomes invisible condition, the kind of condition of preferred invisibility, often as a kind of spectacularity, though not quite in this case. This deflection enables the assertion of the racial in its social conditions and conditionality without calling attention to the raciality of its condition. There are lots of examples you can get. So racism expresses itself in the extreme because delinked from the constraints of its being named as racial injustice. The avoidances of racial reference, of being named in and on these terms, being named as a pariah condition, evidences the lengths to which folks, folk history, privileged folks, folks asserting privilege, ruling folks, the sovereign, in short, while claiming disprivilege, the reach for sovereign power in all registers, will go to purge themselves, to deflect the taint. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I didn't intend it. We are a nation of laws. We stand for justice. Given our history, how dare you suggest, etc., etc., etc. So the post-racial is not simply a racism without race, or a racism without racists, though it's that. But as I've argued elsewhere, a racism, you might say, without racism. This enigmatic condition of the circulation of racisms, renewed, reinvented, resurrected, born again though never dead, without the terms to name it as such, to identify, comprehend, condemn. We could even call this the avatar condition. The post-racial is like the post-colonial, not the end of race, just as the post-colonial indicated not the end of colonial effects, but a different mode or set of modes in which the racial is instantiated, lived out. So just as the post in post-colonial is not the end but the afterlife of the colonial haunting this post-condition, so too the post in post-racial, the afterlife, the ghostly haunting by the racial of the social supposedly rid of the racial. The post-racial is the racial spirit condition of the social. Sociality is unnamed because unnameable spirit. Structurally then, post-raciality is about new markets and the new identities to support them, emanating from but exceeding any traditional mode or expression of raciality. It is raciality that in its enigmatic drive to exceed the bounds and bonds of race, to multiply or proliferate the inputs, does so through denial. A denial not just of historical conditions, but of the contemporary constraints, the legacy of racially driven inequalities, structured by those historical conditions reproduced across time. The post-racial buries, you might say, alive, those very conditions that are the grounds of its own making. But the post-racial is not just the denial of lingering racial conditionality. It's discarding of the racial to the past of history. It's more than that. The post in the post-racial is a denial also about post-racial denial, the deniability of denial itself, right? Deniability is recursive refusal. The sovereign or sovereign population asserts his or their racial, in this sense non-racial, their post-racial innocence, not just by denying that they any longer or ever make or made racial reference or mobilized racist exclusion. They now further deny that they are in denial. They can't possibly be racist now because they never were then. So it's a reconstruction of this history. Their tolerance now, their make-believe openness to all otherness, is evidence of their characteristic tolerance. So they couldn't have been then too. They can't be in denial because tolerant then as now, denial was never an issue. So post-raciality, as this denial of denial, they have turned their past into an empty white canvas, perhaps even a canvas of whiteness, or better yet, a canvassing of whiteness. The post-racial is a vanishing point of race, and the supposed pinprick of racism. I'll take your 2 minutes rather than hers. The post-racial then is also a passage to reversals of who gets charged with racism, of privilege charging the relatively disprivileged, or the insurgent with racisms. So the post-racial is a predictive elaboration of the neoliberal, or as I put it, the hyper-extenuation that is the neoliberal, through the mimetic mixtures and mixings of unleashed and unlicensed social intercourse, almost but not quite anything and everything goes. The mimetic here is the insistence that the standards value social conditions to be aspired to and emulated are those of the racial dominant, of whiteness as see-through condition, as social transparency itself. A transparency that allows these thick traces of racial privilege to be reached only by tracing, you might say, mimicking dominant sensibilities. The post-racial contemporary then is the instantiation, the instancing of, an instant recourse to, the racial without second thought. It has been made the default mode of globalization's neoliberalizing socialities of the skin. So I want to turn, in conclusion, to a different move to complicate this notion of sovereignty. I've just returned from Beirut earlier this week, and a day trip to the borderlands of southern Lebanon, to the vanishing points at which Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Israel don't quite meet but intersect, overlap, map onto as they blur into each other, where the borderlands reach for the precision of definite lines as those blurred lines are impossible to delineate, define, determine. In this blurring of seepage spaces into each other, as in southern Beirut too, the Hizbollah site that got bombed in 2006, and maybe in any critical condition we might mark, for want of a better set of terms, as global southern states, no matter where they geographically are inscribed, post-sovereignty evidences itself. These are the spaces that defy definition, defy the categorizations of conventional social legibility. There are numerous examples I can give, but not enough time. So these examples make evident the inkling of a condition beyond, at the crumbling points, you might say, of sovereignty even as it asserts itself, where the obscurity and transparency of the law are instantaneously exhibited. Hizbollah rebuilds the southern suburbs of Beirut completely outside the law. I mean, building 260 high-rise apartment buildings in 4 years without any recourse to Lebanese law whatsoever. It's amazing. Where decision-making power, the power to decide, is emptied out, where the conventional categories no longer hold. These are not exactly transgressive spaces, because that's to suppose the fixed givens which no longer hold. They are conditions not just flaunting the law, but holding the very grounds of possibility of sovereign law in question. They are not just perversions of a prevailing sovereignty, but perverting space and living arrangement, warped formations in and conventionality themselves. All categorization here for short, fails, is an inadequation. To call them unsettled is to presuppose exactly the settlement they are throwing in question. To insist on their transgression presupposes a domain of law that has no, at best, a floating dominion. To mark them as irregular is to fail to realize their increasingly constitutive irregularity, or regularity as the case may be. Their irregularity within the regular, and their regulation through irregularity, and not simply their exceptionality. So, last word. These may yet prove to be fleeting in their expressibility, capable of expression only by virtue of their delimitation, but they may yet prove also to be the canary in the coal mine of counter-sovereign, unsovereign assertion and the passing of power in our time. As the sites of perversion, warping and bending, perverted spaces you might call them, proliferate, so the recourse to the strategies of post-raciality proliferate. It just may be that we have entered a phase, to use a technical term of art, excuse the expression, of being phenomenologically fucked. Thank you.
Hi. Sovereigns and subjects. The name for this panel, Sovereigns and Subjects, it sounded so simple but contains multitudes. The closer descriptions ask that we look at how sovereigns use their power to define subjects to effect denials of rights to groups based on inclusion, exclusion, and non-recognition. The goal, it seems, is to get us to think about subordination, racial subordination, as a dimension of sovereignty's power to unevenly distribute rights through the creation of various status groupings. I think clearly that happens in various ways, for example, through the use of the sovereign's national security function in creating subordinated status in the case of Muslims and Arabs. People on this very panel have written about how that occurs, how it tracks with the enemy construction of other others, like the Japanese in the internment context, how the sovereign creates the legal forms by which these subordinations take place, the security versus rights trade-off, whereby the group-based exclusions or exceptions to the rule of law are rendered into the individualized abstract form of rights to be balanced against the sovereign's always rather more absolute right to secure itself. In this sense, the security imperative of sovereigns, which is part of the juridical form of sovereignty, it's the right of sovereigns, is a virtual engine of subjection, ineluctably creating denials through inclusions, exclusions, and non-recognition of groupness and thus of subordination. But the question of how sovereigns create these denials of rights seems also to get us to think not just about a particular sovereign, but about sovereignty itself. Is there something about the political way of being that sovereignty sets up, or the kinds of social relations it articulates, that is somehow more structurally tied to these exclusions, to race, for example? Peter Fitzpatrick identifies a central moment in the founding mythology of modern law as the positing of a sovereign subject over against the anti-subjectivities of difference-imbued others, of difference-imbued other figures, the wild, untamed natural man. He says, in mythic terms, this identity of the sovereign subject comes from the creation of European racism. Racism, for Fitzpatrick, made possible the mythic identity of the European as sovereign subject, while denying that identity to those defined by difference. This way of thinking about sovereignty foregrounds its connection to thinking about the subject. Both are racialized categories. Foucault's work on power suggests a similar deep linkage between modern state power and racism. Biopower, the 18th, 19th century supplement to more traditional forms of sovereign power, creates conditions by which the state is compelled to deploy racism as a way of breaking up the species. The shift from sovereign power, the right to kill, toward biopower, the right to make live, the right of the sovereign to make live, meant the state no longer operated from a strictly hierarchical subordinationist script. Its governance of man as species or global mass required a racist technology of sundering, a way to recreate heterogeneity in the species, in life, in order to carry on the real work of state power, which continued with more classical sovereign forms of violence, exclusion, and dispossession, bio-repression, if you will. Another way of understanding the centrality of race to modern sovereignty is through Rob Walker's post-positivist international relations framework. He sees sovereignty as referring to a system of power based on spatial exclusions, having replaced systems based on hierarchical subordination, such as feudalism and papalism. This spatial order results in very different modes of political being. The inside of sovereignty is the realm of progress, ethics, moving forward. The outside, the realm of the non-changing, the non-progressing, the non-ethical. We can see how race spans these two different ways of being political in the world, how it works, for example, through the security function to bring threats outside into the structuring of order, discipline, and governance inside. Outside, race functioned to give structure to the anarchic, providing an ethic, a politics, a sense of progress, if you will. Liberal empire, development, modernization, and the clash of civilizations are all paradigms by which the imperial hierarchical were rationalized outside in racist terms. Sovereignty in its external and internal faces drew upon racist ontology in creating the particular forms of political being we know as modern. A critical progressive theory of sovereignty, like a critical progressive theory of rights and ultimately of human agency and subjectivity, has to grapple with the questions of structure and post-structural understanding of power. China Miéville's Marxist theory of international law may be a sobering starting point for this discussion. Drawing from Anthony Ainge's work on the linkages between international law and empire and Marty Koskaniemi's work on the indeterminacy of international legal forms and arguments, Miéville's Marxist razor cuts through the binaries of law and politics or sovereignty and anarchy by tying the legal and the sovereign directly to imperial capitalism. For Miéville, there is no outside to this iron cage. Sovereignty and the juridical forms it generates, citizens and human rights even, are synonymous with the social relations of capitalism. They are those social relations, not their epiphenomena representations. He even sees the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century as responding to the juridical abstractions that are capitalism, including universalized juridical sovereignty. He states this in bleak terms. The post-war drive to self-determination is not merely a change in the structure or content of international law, but the culmination of the universalizing and abstracting tendencies in international legal capitalism. All joined through hyphenation. International legal capitalism, one thing. And going on, the power dynamics of political imperialism are embedded within the very juridical equality of sovereignty. The line of thinking from post-structuralism is similarly bracing in that it raises the question of how rights-bearing subjects can be agents of transformation when they are primarily or irreducibly the effects of disciplinary forms of power. However, the importance of rights discourse for the subject formation process of excluded groups relativizes these concerns by tying rights to potentially transformative assertions of collective transgressive agency in the form of social movements. Projects to combat the domination of sovereignty's others, defined as they are as spatially, territorially, and ontologically exceptional, have constantly to struggle against the centrality of their marginalization and othering to the system of imperial social relations that sovereignty not only expresses, but perhaps is. For both cosmopolitan liberals who believe in human rights as the great editing tool for shaping a more humanist sovereignty, and neoliberals who ideologically posit the new sovereignty of economic progress through rule of law markets as an improvement over the old sovereignty that promised universal national uplift through state management of the social, the problem of imperial social relations as law remains unaddressed. Perhaps racialized forms of political agency that respond to imperial social relations seem to offer other possibilities, alternatives to the constrained politics of sovereigns and subjects. They do so by engaging power obliquely, even culturally, cultural sovereignty, by affording space for subject formations that may erupt into real politics at unanticipated moments. I think we can study Tahrir Square and beyond from this perspective. The truth about empire is not lost on its anti-subjects. For Muslims and Arabs, the acceleration of their othering after 9/11 has called forth different kinds of responses, some of which seem geared toward compliance with the identity dictates of the security state, the emphasis on maintaining non-transgressive responses, re-embracing market state patriotism and freedom, proving oneself to be a good Muslim in Mamdani's terms. Other responses present a more visibly resistant politics, appropriating the civil rights identities as, quote, the new blacks, politicizing the hallmarks of Muslim Arab racial othering. I do not think we can take such a long view that we equate the meaning of these two types of responses. I think rights, when asserted as part of a process of collective claim-making and mobilization, may present a dialectic within sovereignty and empire. They are at once fitting contingently into the process of empire, perhaps, but also instances of a transformative social conflict, a re-territorializing of politics. I think Emanuel Wallerstein's time frames are crucial here. We shouldn't let the long-term better become the enemy of the mid-term good. We should neither be in love with sovereignty and rights as legal forms of empire, but we may be consigned to work through them for the foreseeable future.
Let me start with a big thank you to Addie, Cheryl, Saul, Rusty, the Critical Race Studies Program, and the American Indian Studies Center. I'm really grateful to have been invited to take part in this conversation. So the story of sovereign and subjects is told from the perspective of the field of U.S. immigration law is typically a narrative of the assertion of national sovereign power that begins in the late 1880s with a trilogy of U.S. Supreme Court cases. These cases, Che Chan-ping, Aque, Fong Yeh-ting, established what is called plenary power over the regulation of immigration, which has meant that the political branches of the U.S. nation state have the power to exclude aliens, to admit them on terms as it sees fit, and to deport them with little or no constraint from the judicial branch. This trilogy of cases responded to the exclusion and deportation of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, and in 2 of these cases to race-based immigration restrictions, a fact that has not escaped scholars. The racial bars to immigration and citizenship, about which much has been written, are hopefully familiar, and I will not dwell on them here, other than to say that research showing how these racial bars limited the lives and possibilities of particular communities, of course, casts an important critique to the prevalent narrative of a nation of immigrants, which promises the purportedly equal opportunity of arrival as a lawful immigrant and subsequent full incorporation into a presumptively universal citizenship. This promise, of course, has not been equally available, belied by race-based exclusion, laws, racial restrictions on naturalization, de jure and de facto violations of the rights one might correlate with full citizenship, and the inadequacy of the liberal vision of full citizenship in attending to various inequalities. The racial critique of liberal exclusion is an important one. At the same time, the racial critique of liberal exclusion, particularly when its frame remains membership in the nation state, masks other stories. One story, elided by the racial critique of liberal exclusion, which I think Lisa Lowe may talk about tomorrow, is the way that the push for rights and the struggle for citizenship within the nation diverts our focus from the U.S. national security state and its relations to ideas of morality, humanitarianism, rescue, just war, preemptive war, the free and unfree, the liberator and liberated. Another story elided by the racial critique of liberal exclusion, which I anticipate others will address, is the way in which, in Patrick Wolf's phrase, democracy's intolerance of difference is operated through inclusion as much as through exclusion, through what Bethany Berger calls coercive attempts at inclusion, demanding that we understand that both historically and in the present day, that what Julian Aguin calls, quote, full absorption into the body politic of the state under color of notions of fairness and equality is actually what he calls the perfect tool to thwart claims of native self-governance. And a third story, elided by the racial critique of liberal exclusion, and the one to which I want to devote most of my time, is thinking about the way in which the immigration stories focus on membership in the nation state absolutely elides the being of already existing populations. This is the willing amnesia of settler colonialism. As many of the participants in this conference have described, the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, the perception of native inhabitants as having no recognizable form of sovereign government, allowed settlers to form what they saw as a new social contract, a settler contract, in the words of Carol Pateman, creating civil society anew. In Keholani Ka'ao'anui's words, white settlers worked to indigenize themselves, to, as Aziz Rana writes, transform themselves into natives, making, as Keholani writes, a race-based claim to sovereignty articulated in terms of a self-governing social contract. Thus, if the call of this panel is to examine the relationship between sovereign and subject, and especially how sovereigns have subordinated specific populations using combined strategies of exclusion, inclusion, and non-recognition, I'm interested here in examining the non-recognition of settler colonialism within immigration law scholarship. This non-recognition is apparent in the fact that the terms through which we study concepts in the field, citizen, alien, borders, migration, birthright citizenship, cannot address the actual relationship between immigration and indigenous populations. Some of this has to do with how immigration scholarship thinks about space. The field largely presumes the tradition of Westphalian territorial sovereignty, whereby a single sovereign controls absolutely a defined territory and its associated and racinated population. Under this system, the legal jurisdiction of the sovereign is entirely congruent with its territorial borders in a way that would correlate with how maps are drawn. With recent concern expressed about fragmenting nation states or extraterritorial reaches of sovereign power potentially absent constitutional restraint, for example, Guantanamo, which raise what is described as the novel problem of the attenuation between territorial space and governance. This model of territorial sovereignty forgets the possibility of a kind of layered sovereignty that might more accurately describe the relationship between indigenous sovereignty and the sovereignty of settler society. And some of this has to do with how immigration scholarship thinks about time. In general, immigration scholarship presumes not only that borders are spatially fixed, but also that they are fixed over time, that states have always existed within their current territorial borders. The focus of inquiry is the lawfulness of the already existing state's deployment of sovereignty to keep out or kick out non-citizens. Largely forgotten are how states came to be. I thought it might be useful to see what Michael Walzer, author of what has probably been the most influential philosophical defense of immigration sovereignty in his book Spheres of Justice, has to say about these questions. His thesis is that nation-states, like families, neighborhoods, and clubs, are normatively justified in seeking closure against outsiders to the community in order to promote their mutual affinity. In his chapter on membership, he also makes the less noticed argument that Linda Bosniak has drawn attention to, that once inside, any strangers should be recognized as members to avoid the democratic crisis posed by guest workers, the present-day version of the Athenian medic. But given that Walzer claims to be developing a theory as to the right of the nation-state to control immigration, what does he say about indigenous inhabitants? There is, in fact, a little noticed passage that speaks to persons who are already in a territory when a state seeks to assert its sovereignty. Interestingly, Walzer casts this only as a problem created in the present day. He writes, and this is a fairly long quote, "Though the recognition of national affinity is a reason for permitting immigration, non-recognition is not a reason for expulsion. This is a major issue in the modern world, for many newly independent states find themselves in control of territory into which alien groups have been admitted under the auspices of the old imperial regime. Sometimes these people are forced to leave, the victims of a popular hostility that the new government cannot restrain. More often, the government itself fosters such hostility. Hobbes made the argument in classical form when he listed those rights that are given up and those that are retained when the social contract is signed. The state owes something to its inhabitants simply, without reference to their collective or national identity. And the first place to which the inhabitants are entitled is surely the place where they and their families have lived and made a life. The attachments and expectations they have formed argue against a forced transfer to another country. If they can't have this particular piece of land, then some other must be found for them within the same general, quote, place, close quote." That's the end of the quote. So let me make two observations, both of which I think are important. The first, so that while Walzer does think there's something wrong about deporting original inhabitants to another country altogether, he promotes the idea that some other piece of land must be found for them within the same general place, which sounds like nothing so much as the idea of removal and reservation. And it is not clear why removal from this particular piece of land does not wreak the same kind of violation of justice that transfer to another country might, when these first inhabitants might not have any particular attachment to the nation-state boundary that has been now created by this new state. Second, Walzer casts the original inhabitant in this narrative as a, quote, alien. Now, Walzer's description of an old imperial regime admitting alien groups and newly independent states might describe something like the former Soviet Union and the new Baltic states, which had to decide what to do about Russian inhabitants when they created Estonia or Latvia citizenship. He does not specify what cases he is considering. Regardless, as the only text in spheres of justice attending to the question of persons already there when a new state is formed, we can read this as his prescription as to what to do about indigeneity. There's something curious about the term alien to describe those already there, as the commonplace sense of alien suggests temporarily a person arriving anew at the borders of an already formed nation state, not someone already living on that land. But we must note that, in fact, indigenous persons have been transformed into aliens. We know from Audra Simpson's work what happened along the U.S.-Canada border despite the Jay Treaty signed in 1794, guaranteeing the rights of Indian peoples to traverse the U.S.-British divide freely. Following the passage of the National Origins Quotas Act in 1924, beginning the era of numerical restrictions in U.S. immigration law, and in May Nye's words, raising the border, and the Indian Citizenship Act passed the same year, making statutory citizens of Indians born in the territory of the United States. Mohawk iron worker named Paul Diablo, who lived in Canada and worked in New York, found himself deported from the United States as an alien. Challenging this for a writ of habeas corpus, he argued successfully that the Jay Treaty recognized the long-standing right of Six Nations people to freely cross the border, in the words of the district court decision, which was upheld by the Third Circuit, quote, "From the Indian viewpoint, he crosses no boundary line. For him, this does not exist." And Lila Kawar has also shown us how indigenous persons have been transformed into aliens, writing of the Israeli attempt to deport Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem. As she writes, after the Israeli assertion of sovereignty over East Jerusalem in 1967, Palestinian residents were given the, quote, choice to register for Israeli citizenship, which obviously Palestinians who chose not to recognize Israeli sovereignty refused to do. But this meant that the status of resident alien became seen as freely exercised individual choice, leading to what has been called a quiet deportation. As Kawar writes, in the aftermath of a territorial conflict that defines or redefines the bounds of the state, racially marked indigenous populations are vulnerable to being legally recast as aliens or virtual immigrants.
The making of already present populations into aliens is also shown by Knoll Parker in his study of African Americans and poor relief in late 18th century Massachusetts. It's now commonly pointed out that deportation in the United States was not initially a federal practice. It originated on the local level with the institution inheritance from English poor laws through the deportation of paupers. So the system of poor relief regulated what we understand as immigration. It sought to secure territorial communities against the claims of outsiders. Within this system, the law of settlement, legal responsibility for the individual's claims lay with the town from which he came. Accordingly, a person could be denied relief because he was not from here, but from there. After slavery was ended in Massachusetts, African Americans threw the system into crisis. When enslaved, they were the fiscal responsibility of their slave masters. When they emerged from slavery, they were suddenly the subjects making claims, but they had not come from another town. They were here without having a there to belong to. What Parker found was that town communities assigned African Americans who were elderly or sick and needed financial help to geographic origins outside of Massachusetts, to a place called Africa, to represent them as foreigners who were the legal responsibility of somewhere else. As he writes, the state invented immigrant origins to justify refusing their claims upon the community. He argues that this shows that actual bodily spatial movement may not be the critical thing about immigrants, and that we should not let it be so, because otherwise it allows the presumption that there is always a there that a person can go back to and be the responsibility of. Instead, we should see in his historical study, as well as in Simpson and Kawar's work, that persons, regardless of their spatial movement or lack thereof, become aliens, that the relationship between citizenship and territory emerges as a tactic. As Lila Kawar says, Israel has been juridically formulated into a state with immigration problems rather than a state engaged in a project of conquest and settlement. One could say the same of the United States. And the immigration problems that exist in the United States are certainly not imagined to be the fault of the United States. They are the fault of the hordes, to use the former UCLA student Alexandra Wallace's term, which I must invoke. I don't know if people have seen that amazing video, Ching Chong, it means I love you. All right. The fault of the hordes of illegal aliens, criminal aliens, putative terrorists, and culturally unassimilable others who threaten Western liberal values and traditions of tolerance, who are swamping the shores, flooding the gates, and dying in the desert. The nation of immigrants narrative, while critiqued for its false promises, seems so, to use the phrasing of the last panel, genetically encoded in the DNA, that the terra nullius presumed by the social contract is embedded in how U.S. immigration law is generally taught and studied. The nation of immigrants metaphor suggests that immigrants in the United States step into the shoes of their forefathers who made the settler contract in brotherhood among themselves in relationship to virgin land, birthing a new nation. Note the sort of reproductive impossibilities of this, but anyway. Birthing a new nation in a perverse purported right of inherited biological descent and destiny from the sons of the American Revolution to the white immigrant sons, so that these founding fathers' alien status goes unrecognized even while indigenous populations are made aliens.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank all the amazing organizers, Cheryl, Saul, Addie, Mashana, Angela, Rusty, and the American Indian Studies Center, and the Center Critical Race Studies program. It seems like we've been waiting for these confluences to happen for a long time, but a lot of people have actually been pushing and cajoling and twisting the arms of administrators to make it happen. So I'm appreciating that. I'm also appreciating and recognizing that we're here today because of those whose land we're on, and we're here today because of all those labors, visible and invisible, that helped us get here. So I'm presenting a paper called The Practice of Autonomy in the Age of Neoliberalism, Strategies from Indigenous Women's Organizing in Mexico. So I'm going to change the context a little bit, but also the theoretical frame. So when I'm talking about autonomy, and this is a much longer conversation, what I'm talking about is sovereignty projects, right? Sovereignty projects articulated by indigenous social movements. So globalization, often an elliptical reference to neoliberal economic policies, have brought an increasingly sophisticated form of exploitation to indigenous peoples of the Americas. In response, new forms of resistance have been waged by a wide range of groups who have utilized the globalization of rights discourse to fight a wide range of struggles, like the right of Pachamama, the right of Mother Earth, right? The recreation and the co-option of rights discourse to take it in new and interesting ways. We see that in the Bolivian struggle. But it's happening at the time of what, is probably best characterized as a perverse confluence increased mobilization of Latin American social movements, indigenous social movements, and the rise of neoliberal state projects. Not the rise, but the consolidation of them. So this perverse confluence between mass-based indigenous movements throughout Latin America, whose demands are the right to have rights, has shaken states. Their militancy has shaken states and taken over some states, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the state, which has adopted a neoliberal strategy of rolling back its role as the guarantor of those rights. So we're in this interesting confluence. Those analyzing state responses to the rise of indigenous mobilization in Latin America have begun to observe that states, instead of denying or repressing these social movement demands, have begun instead a strategy of selective co-option, whereby minimal recognition of these rights leads to an increased role by the state in the constitution and regulation of identities through administrative and technocratic power. Instead of being seen as contradictory to neoliberalism, indigenous rights, and cultural rights more generally in Latin America, are increasingly being seen as part of neoliberal governmentality. Scholars of indigenous rights movements who have been analyzing the perils of selective co-option of indigenous rights theorize the ways in which indigenous demands for autonomy may not challenge, but indeed be part of the cultural logic of neoliberalism. For example, Charles Hale argues that the minimal recognition of indigenous rights and the multicultural nature of Latin America, they're just recognizing this now, which he calls neoliberal multiculturalism, promotes increased cultural rights and limited indigenous autonomy as states roll back their social welfare policies, and identity is managed through civil society and an increasingly bureaucratic logic of the state. So they're like, oh, you want autonomy? Great. We weren't actually so interested in, giving you these rights. It has this, that indigenous autonomy echoes the role of self-governance in neoliberal logics. So while scholars have increasingly analyzed these demands of how indigenous autonomy fits into the cultural logic of neoliberalism, feminist scholars have examined also the detrimental effect of this selective co-option of the feminist movement's rights. In the longer paper I'm drawing from, I explore that. But the intervention I want to make here is to call attention to the ways in which indigenous claims have been engaged and managed by the neoliberal state through a discourse of gender. In fact, if we examine closely how the Mexican government has understood and denied indigenous claims, we see that the state's engagement has revolved around the question of gender. So what I want to do is share with you some strategies deployed within the indigenous women's rights movement in Mexico to these new forms of neoliberal governmentality. I'll discuss how indigenous women's rights activists ground the political demand for indigenous autonomy by shifting it from a discourse of rights into a daily practice exercised within the gendered forms of labor, politics, and sociality. The first example I'm going to give you draws from how indigenous women activists have reshaped the debate on autonomy through their own grassroots forms of consultation that focus on gendered practices within communal and decision-making structures. So this strategy moves away from a concept of autonomy as a right guaranteed by the state to a practice of decolonization that is part of everyday life, community sociality, and which is a critical strategy given the state in recalcitrance, which I'm going to describe further. The second section of the talk explores how organized indigenous women's groups have refuted the ways in which the Mexican government has used this gendered cultural logic of racism, which co-opts women's rights arguments against indigenous autonomy, specifically in relation to what is commonly referred to as usos y costumbres, customs and practices, indigenous law. Finally, as neoliberal forms of governments gain predominance in Latin America, many social services and the maintenance and construction of political subjectivities are being regulated through civil society in a growing NGO sector. So the third example, which I probably will only briefly touch on, illustrates how indigenous rights activists are taking back the increasing power of NGOs to define, represent, and regulate their identities and cultural norms. So a little context first. Surprising many, Mexico was the second country and the first in Latin America to ratify Convention 169 of the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples of the ILO, or the International Labor Organization, in 1990. Aligning its national legislation framework with Convention 169, Mexico passed Article 4 of its Constitution in 1992 amidst increased demands for indigenous movements that became united. You might have remembered that quincentennial celebration of Columbus's so-called discovery of the Americas. So the government was feeling some pressure under that. They adopted Article 4, which purportedly was positive in nature, and yet was importantly at the time in which NAFTA and free trade and a neoliberal project was being firmly implemented. So for example, this is part of that perverse confluence. In order to create a context for global capital and free trade, the ejido system, or collective land tenure system, in Mexico was one of the last remaining victories of the Mexican Revolution, was dismantled the same year as the passage of Article 4, right, in order to make way for NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So what I'm saying is they're, in symbolically giving rights, recognizing the pluricultural nature of Mexico, and then at the same time taking away the land base, the collective land tenure system. So in some sense, scholars and activists have talked about how this reflected the minimalist nature of the state's responsibilities, while at the same time ignoring the social and economic factors that prevent indigenous people from truly exercising their rights, but also reproduces the authority of the state over the acceptable practices of indigenous peoples. So as many of you know, the Chiapas uprising on January 1st, 1994, the day NAFTA went into effect, brought much attention brought to public light several of these tensions, disrupting the myth of progress and exposing the devastating poverty, racism, and neglect of Mexico's 56 different indigenous pueblos. And I don't translate the word pueblos because I mean peoples, nations, what we call nations, but peoples and communities. In 1996, after long debate and negotiation, the Commission on Concordance and Pacification, that's not that great in English, Commission on Concordance and Pacification, the COCOPA, I'll call it, proposed their initiative for constitutional reform based on the San Andrés Peace Accords on indigenous rights and culture that were signed both by the Zapatista Army of National Liberation and governmental representatives in February of that year. Despite being designed by governmental representatives and receiving mass approval after the widespread deliberation or consulta that the Zapatistas used in the National Indigenous Congress, the then President Ernesto Zedillo rejected the plan. This led to a very long stalemate in which another president was elected. Oh my gosh, I have 2 minutes. And, he said he could fix the Indian problem in 2 minutes, actually. That's what he said. Did he say 2 minutes or 2 days? I'm misquoting that. Okay, but I really think, Fox said he could fix the Indian problem in 2 minutes, and which he actually went on to get the Indian Rights Bill in 2001 passed, which is essentially guts COCOPA. It guts meaningful recognition of indigenous self-determination. So the work I've been doing, and now I'm going to go really, really fast, is thinking about how indigenous women rights activists have engendered the right to have rights by multiplying the different spaces of autonomy within their lives. So they supported indigenous autonomy, which in Mexico in the movement means the right to be a pueblo, a people, the right to land, protection of territory, self-determination, cultural traditions, forms of political representation and jurisprudence, the right to protect and use natural resources, and the right to land. The indigenous women's movement supported this, and through their own process of consultation, right, through indigenous forms of deliberation and community-based governance, they took these claims and made them mean all kinds of things that their comrades in the movement were like, wait, that's not what we meant, right? So they made them mean autonomy to your body, autonomy to women's bodily, political, and economic autonomy, autonomy in the right to land. So they expanded the meaning greatly. So one of their manifestos reads, we believe autonomy for our people includes all areas of our lives, the home, family, community, and region. That's what I'm calling zones of autonomy. And that has to do with respect and recognition of our cultures, our territories, and our traditional medicine and knowledge. For us, autonomy means parity, democracy, and equity between men and women, indigenous and non-indigenous, between all humans, and above all, that our rights are recognized as the original peoples we are. So you can see that they didn't really mean the formal juridical sense. They kept applying this to mean all kinds of things. But in this, I think there was a critical remapping of what we would call sovereignty here, what they call autonomy. They're not necessarily exactly the same thing. But that led to an important form of resistance in the face of state incalcitrance. So this one idea that I'm teasing out in my work is, and I've been publishing on this before, is that the idea that the state is regulating indigenous subjects through a gendered logic of racism. So I can illustrate this very quickly. The day the uprising happened in January 1994, the government said that there wasn't a truly indigenous uprising. One, because it was organized. Right? Two, it was timely, it happened in the morning, right? And that's incredibly racist, right? Two, because it was feminist. So they said there was feminist infiltrators. And so it was not only well organized and executed, but it had 30% of all its fighting forces were women. Women were leading several of the comandantes are women, but that they had this women's law, right, that included the right to women to equality, a life free of violence, equal pay, the right to choose their partner, when and whether to bear children. All this was codified in the Women's Revolutionary Law, which was a process of this form of consultation between Tzetzal and Tzotzil communities in Chiapas. But what scholars don't pay attention to is that all this form of consultation also went on nationally in Mexico, and that in Guerrero and Oaxaca, all throughout Mexico, there's been this consultation. And yet, so on the one hand, they deny that the movement is authentically indigenous because it has these women's claims. On the other hand, come 2001, in front of the Congress, they say, well, we can't give you indigenous rights because indigenous rights violates women's rights. Right? So they use this dual logic of racism in which this notion of gender is a form of governmentality, right? That we can regulate who are proper indigenous subjects, who are the subjects of rights, by playing one of our other social movement demands, gender justice, against, rights. And so we've seen this before, right? Individual versus collective rights. And so this gendered logic of racism not only shaped indigenous rights debates, it's also served as a linchpin of those debates. In fact, the government tactic is deployed so often, we might see how subjects are being regulated through this discourse. And in this paper, I go on to show how activists contest that and how it's continuing to recycle a discourse in which indigenous peoples are seen as backward, stubborn roadblocks to modernity. But what's different now is that modernity is measured through gender rights, right? And so it's interesting that in this kind of formulation, what's new is how Mexico's advancement as a nation is now measured using gender as a major indicator of modernity and progress through a neoliberal co-option of gender technocratic language of the IMF and World Bank. So the last section of my paper, I talk about how at the 10th Encuentro Feminista, or feminist gathering in Mexico, Brazil actually, there was a massive conversation having to do with racial, ethnic, and sexual and generational differences within feminism, in Latin American feminism. And all 1,500 participants debated these difficult dialogues, is what they were calling them. So here we come, and then we're in this session on Amazonian Indigenous Women Organization and Resistance, and it happens that almost all Native women who were at that conference were in that panel. And it was going along really great until a lawyer who worked for an NGO stood up and made her presentation in which she started with the grand narrative of how indigenous people in the past had this beautiful culture and they invented science and technology. But in present day, she went on to spin this narrative of barbarism and savagery, but really on the axis of sexism, right? That indigenous men are somehow more sexist. And so what was really fascinating to watch is how indigenous women activists, one by one, got up and challenged this and tried to reframe and tried to look at the problematic ways in which the lawyer was splitting gender from cultural rights, as if you could be privileged enough to decide one day which one you were going to deal with. And so I thought this was an important site to really think through not just how states are regulating subjects, but how inadvertently even lawyers, or how even through human rights discourse, that forms of subjectivity and autonomy are being regulated. And so I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there. Thank
I too will start by thanking the persons who made my participation here possible, beginning with my friend Cheryl Harris. We haven't seen you in Guam in a long time, Cheryl. You need to pay a visit again. Okay, and of course to everybody else who collaborated in making it so easy for us to participate and exchange ideas. I'm particularly happy to follow you, Maylei, because I'm seeing the other side of Mexico than the side that the Mexican government presented in Geneva for 20 years as a champion of the drafting of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's very interesting to juxtapose the two. At the same time, I think I should say, and I mentioned this at the concurrent panel earlier, that for me it's really rather important to find cracks and wedges in the opposition so that we do not overly strengthen them by painting the picture of a granite block that, never moves and never cracks. Because actually there were some people in the Mexican governmental delegation that I think went very far in trying to force the government back in Mexico City to go along with certain things which they essentially had orders to hold the line on. But in general, the Mexican government was very successful once the declaration left Geneva and came to New York to weaken it considerably in the New York Forum. And I just wanted to mention something here in the about the UN system. It's very interesting. Again, it goes back to my theme of cracks and crevices, which is that the declaration started its life, in a little committee that states thought was too unimportant to attend. So it was wonderful. We walk into a room, there'd be 500 to 800 indigenous peoples and like 2 state representatives. And I always advise you, in oppositional politics, bring lots of people. That is already half the battle right there. And so things happen in that context that could not have happened in New York. And so in a sense, this human rights project of the UN is a sort of like half-sister, pushed away in Geneva until it gets important, and that's when it comes to New York, and then the full force of the state is deployed. Okay, that was just a footnote. Sorry, the footnote took 2 minutes already, did it? Okay. Okay, let me now talk about my topic, and it is about the what I believe and hope is an emerging norm in international relations and eventually international law of indigeneity. And I'll try to explain that later, but I would like to address the subject in 3 segments. First, giving a context for the topic. Secondly, I want to then tell you a little bit about how the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples came to be through 20 years of hard lobbying by indigenous peoples from around the world. And then thirdly, end with an application of parts of the declaration to 3 cases for 3 struggles for indigenous rights that I'm currently involved in. Okay, let me just first start with the context. And here, I would like to sort of turn the question that we were posed around from the relevance of the concepts of race and sovereignty to our subjects, our practices, in this case, indigenous people's rights. I think it's not so much a question of relevance as a question of sufficiency. And if asked as, are they sufficient, I would say no. Are they relevant? I would say yes. And that therefore we need to continue to grow our constructs and practices to meet, changing circumstances. And the circumstance that most troubles me, and I think all of us, is that in fact we are at what I would call the Fukushima moment of predatory global capitalism, where we have this monster displaying, fully its inexorable drive to dismember everything, dismember communities and dismember ecologies. And in one respect, indigenous peoples, because they have been pushed, many of them, into certain recesses of geography in the past, but predatory capitalism needs those recesses too. So in one sense, they have caught up with indigenous communities. So the entire logic has come, there's no escape, hence the Fukushima moment, as I call it. Okay, I would like to quote from a fellow anthropologist in Hawaii who participates with Julian Agua and Kehaulani Kawanui, myself and others in the Hawaiian independence movement. What I quote is not anything about the Hawaiian independence movement, but it is about that monster that I just talked about. He just came out with a book called Globalization and Social Disorder, and this is what he says. The assumption, largely anthropological, is that social order depends upon secure access to resources by groups within a society and predictable transactions among them. That is, transactions sanctioned by established norms. The hypothesis of the book is that the global economy continually interferes with access to resources and predictable transactions among groups and categories of people. This sets the stage for the creation of new ideologies to mobilize those who are disadvantaged by constantly changing economic and social relationships, leading to campaigns of mass killing. Now, that last part is a bit of a leap, but maybe not such a big leap, but I'm hoping that here we can work not on new ideologies as such, but new narratives and practices that would lead to the reconnection of communities and ecologies. This is really the setting that I would like to present my remarks within. Okay. Now, I would like to basically propose that the norm of indigeneity has relevance, has import for both indigenous peoples and communities in a way that is different from its relevance to the rest of us who are also at the mercy of the global monster. And this is so because indigenous communities are still very much interacting on a daily basis type of communities that anthropologists recognize, which the film on Rod Miller yesterday showed. Many of us no longer belong to such communities, but indigenous peoples and we both depend very much on the sustainability of ecologies. So for indigenous peoples, I think the norm of indigeneity refers to the sustainability of communities and ecologies. For us, perhaps more the sustainability of ecologies. But I want to make sure this is not too much of a wannabe thing when I say that indigeneity has relevance and promise for both indigenous communities and also the rest of us. The best and the rest, perhaps, is one way of putting it. Anyway, in the process of addressing the theme of the panel, I just spent a little time thinking about terms that we have used in our anti-hegemonic scholarship and political practices, and what are more relevant, less relevant, what else we need. And I won't have time to nor the desire particularly, nor the expertise, that's for sure, to sort of evaluate them all. But I'm just going to unload, just like that, on you a set of terms and suggest that the first set is less useful to indigenous peoples than the second set. I think this is more to provoke some thinking for the rest of the conference, but not. And then after that, I'll go immediately to describing the genesis of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, otherwise known by the unfortunate acronym of UNDRIP. Okay? All right. Okay. So the first set of terms that we have been using, which I think is beginning to need supplementation by another set of terms. So the first set that I think is not sufficient would include the terms race, in my view, sovereignty, state, subjects, nation state, the rule of positivist law. The second set, which I believe is more useful in the work that I do, includes the term race. It belongs, race is one term that I would put on both sets. Ethnicity, settler colonialism, self-determination. I don't put sovereignty in there, I just put self-determination in the second set. Sovereignty in the first, self-determination in the second. Culture, indigeneity, territoriality, that's very important. Partnership, which I'll explain in the next part on the UNDRIP, and the norm of free, prior, and informed consent, which was alongside the norm of self-determination, a key fight that we decided to hang in there in Geneva for 20 years to obtain rather than to agree to not have. And I'll explain that too as I explain the genesis of the declaration. I also think, of course, that the term nation remains very helpful in the second set. And perhaps we should begin to abandon entirely the term nation-state, which was always fictive in any event, and perhaps begin to think of the corporation state, because that's really what we see, the hijacking of states by corporations in the world today. All right. Then I just want to say, and this came up because of what you said, Maylei, you use the word autonomy a lot, and I would be curious to hear in the discussion between us how that is differentiated, if at all, from the right to self-determination as opposed to the right of autonomy, okay? Because in Geneva, we refused to have the term autonomy enter the declaration, but were unable to prevent its intrusion in Article 4. All right. Now, let me go now immediately to the question that might interest you most, which is the genesis of the UNDRIP. First of all, it is the first instrument, international instrument, that is really heavily co-authored by non-state agents. I think that's very important. As I said, 600 of us in the room versus 2 of them from the States. And this was the case for about the first 5 years, or even almost going to the first 10 years of the drafting of the declaration. It was when the first committee, the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples, which consists of so-called independent experts, an institution that's quite interesting because it is really at the margin of the state, much more linked up to the state than to groups like indigenous peoples, nevertheless not immediately answerable to the state. That's a little wedge, that's a little crevice in the state machinery that the UN system offers and we've been able to exploit. Okay, so they put at the end of the first 10 years, an Article 3 that says indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of this, they determine their political status, etc. They repeat, verboten the language of the classical statement of self-determination in UN instruments like the Declaration of Granting of Independence and the 2 international human rights covenants. All right. So when that went into the draft, then states woke up and said, oh my God, what is going on here? And then they began to attend. But in a way, the die was sort of cast. All right. Now, the other thing that was very interesting with the genesis is that there was a big split in the indigenous representation between those who were going to fight to the death to get the self-determination article preserved all the way through the adoption by the General Assembly, and the other half that, the states wooed and wooed and wooed to discard, to let go of that. So the fight really why it lasted 20 years was because states were opposed to 2 key points: the right to self-determination and the right to free, prior, and informed consent over all matters that affect their communities. That's a pretty big right. I mean, in a way, it's an operationalizing of the right of self-determination. Okay. All right. Now, we managed to get both in, and free, prior, and informed consent appears 6 times in the actual declaration. It would have appeared 7 times because it also was included in the provisions banning military activities on indigenous territory, but the states couldn't live with that, and they pressured enough indigenous peoples that, it got modified to where, except in the case of national interest, which is of course always the national interest. But so, all right, so those are some of the key tugs of war that happened there. Now, the declaration is accepted, the fight on its interpretation is on. This is where, we have a lot of work cut out for us. And President Obama, unfortunately, in January, when he signed on to the declaration, gave it an interpretation that I'm sure was written by a team of lawyers at the State Department. It said, we welcome, I paraphrase, we welcome the declaration. After all, it states exactly what we have been doing in terms of law and policy vis-a-vis the tribes in our country. It was like, this is Obama at his worst, and from my point of view, just about, which is very, very sorry that it's happened this way. But it's a declaration. We have to expect the interpretive fight, and it is on. And I think that in Latin America, of all the regions, there have been some extraordinary wins on the interpretation of the declaration in Belize, in Suriname, and of course in Nicaragua. I'm aware of perhaps new ones coming up. All right. In addition to self-determination, free, prior, informed consent, the whole section of the Declaration absolutely confers the right to territoriality on indigenous communities. So I think that that is a very important one. It also confers a right to have treaties observed. And this is a big one for indigenous groups that have historical treaties with their settler states. Finally, the last major gain in the Declaration, in my view, is that it confers, basically encourages indigenous people's participation at international fora. And the UN has been very good about that. Virtually every agency, conferences on sustainable development, etc., invitations go out to indigenous peoples to participate. And this, I think, is very important. This is, in other words, these are the things that we'll have to look for rather than is it indigenous people, a sovereign in the Westphalian sense or not. That may or may not be important in certain cases. Certainly in Hawaii, the independence movement would want that. But at the same time, the indigenous peoples have room through the norm of indigeneity, through this declaration, to really expand the area of authorship of their lives. And the authorship would be the authorship to create narratives and practices that conserve their communities, conserve the connections of their communities and of the latter with their geographies. Okay, let me just very quickly state the relevance of this to three things that I'm involved in. First of all, very quickly, the American Indian Law Alliance was a major player in the Indigenous caucus for the 20 years and stood with the side that would not budge on the issue of self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent, including the application of that norm to militarization. We lost it. Some of our Hawaiian participants were not as clear-headed about that, Kehaulani, unfortunately, and there was some slipped in with the group that said, okay, we'll remove free, prior, and informed consent from military activities. Okay, but what they also have done since then is to demand a role and a voice in international fora that are deciding anything at all that relate to the provisions of the Declaration and then interpret it very expansively. The second project I'm currently involved with is an initiative of the Lakota Nation. It's called the Ove'aku International Justice Project. It encompasses many things within that project, but the main item right now is an attempt to do what it takes to have the ICJ issue an advisory opinion on the U.S.'s obligations under the Fort Laramie treaties with the Lakota Nation. The third project is, of course, the independence movement in Hawaii. And there, I think you will be talking about this in your panel a little bit, because if you will, then I'll stop right here. If not, I'll outline the three options.
No, in closing comments, go with it.
Okay, fine. There are different strategies that are dangling out there in front of the Kanaka Maoli people in Hawaii. One is independence. Now, of course, if the Kanaka Maoli opt for independence, one way might be to get reinscribed on the list of non-self-governing territories from which Hawaii was fraudulently removed by the U.S. in 1959, fraudulent at least on 2 counts. The issue of independence, which is expected to be put to the vote, was not included. Secondly, the remedy of the self-determination referendum ought to belong to the entity that was harmed. But the people who got to vote on this were folks that just got off the boat from Kansas, like yesterday, basically, okay? And so but then once the vote came through, then the U.S. went to the non-self-governing territory and said they agreed to become a part of us. So then that got removed, and that was the end of the story, so they hope. Julian Argon will be talking about Guam, where the exact same maneuver is being planned, that, a vote would be held because, as I mentioned to Guam, I think that you can conceive of what's happening in Guam as the U.S. relocating the remnants of Subic Bay and Okinawa onto Guam and Hawaii. That's going to be Fortress America right there. So then Guam is a very small island, 30 miles long, and to put, Subic Bay and Okinawa on a little 30-mile stretch of land means you have to engage in considerable ethnic cleansing, right? And then you have to have the people vote that they want to be ethnically cleansed, I guess, right? So I understand that there's a move afoot from the U.S. side to have a referendum in Guam that all but replicates the 1959 referendum in Hawaii. And again, the argument is that anybody who has a 30-day residency on Guam should be able to vote whether they want to stay in the non-self-governing territories to be decolonized or they should become incorporated within the states. So in those two cases, the classic decolonization model is obviously, the one that many want and that I think myself is the clearest way to undo the problem of imperialism, which is decided to center itself right there on these two islands. However, not everybody in Hawaii thinks that because of internal colonization, etc. So whether people are yet agreed on the independence move or not, my view is that the UNDRIP should immediately be put into practice because that addresses not a multi-ethnic nation, state down the road, but immediately offers tools for protecting the territories and communities of indigenous peoples. Then lastly, there is another move which really basically focuses on restoring the monarchy. I guess since I'm not much of a monarchist, I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Well, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the panelists for sticking to time and galloping through presentations to enable us to have a conversation with them now. And I have to say that I'm delighted to see that I'm not the fastest talker in the group by a long shot, which is fantastic from my perspective. So I'm going to launch with one question, but I really do invite folks to come forward, or if you want to ask your questions then loudly from the back as well. But one of our tasks today was to think about the possibilities and limitations of reconceptualizations of sovereignty, whether they could be new forms of agency, whether they could produce modalities of resistance, whether there are alternative paradigms of sovereignty that are available against the backdrop of sovereignties that have enacted the forms of erasure and disappearance that we've heard about this morning and again today. A number of terms were used jointly among different panelists. Sovereignty, of course, was one of them, like this morning, raising terminological questions, but also autonomy, connectedness, counter-sovereignty, post-raciality, and they've been used in a variety of ways. I'm just going to say briefly that we've heard from Professor Goldberg about sovereignty in the Schmittian sense, but also as a mechanism that's fragmenting, that's subject to fragmentation, seeking new forms of coherence, potentially through these modalities of post-raciality. From Professor Gott, we heard about sovereignty as a coercive practice of subject formation that also produces certain kinds of resistance practice that causes the interpolation of racialized subjects in a variety of ways. We have heard from Professor Volpp about the already present peoples and their erasures through practices of sovereignty that then assert alternative paradigms, alternative laws, alternative models, turning immigration into a question and a problem as opposed to drawing attention to the functioning of coercion in the production of that model of immigration. We heard from Professor Blackwell about this idea of autonomy and the possibility of resisting state strategies of co-optation by recuperating a conception of autonomy, and it was queried by Professor Lam, is this something that is consistent with self-determination, distinct from it in meaningful ways? How can we conceive of autonomy as it's been styled in the Mexican case study that we heard? And finally, Professor Lam in her wide-ranging comments began and ended with this idea of how can we think about the emerging norm of indigeneity as a resource potentially to resist some of the other trends that we see bringing pressure on indigenous and other communities in the form of globalization, predatory capitalism, and so forth. So that's a very, very wide-ranging set of uses of a single shared vocabulary. And I'm going to just invite our panelists to reflect on ways in which they see either connections or differences in their usage of these terms, and then turn the floor over to the audience.
since I already commented. Maybe.
Well, why don't I start with you, Professor Blackwell, just on autonomy and self-determination, that question of what does it mean?
I was getting a little dazed there. Sorry. It wasn't you. So autonomy, I can't say it's co-equal to sovereignty, but it is a formal legal right. It is the way in which indigenous social movements and indigenous peoples in Mexico organize their claim to what we know as sovereignty. They don't have the dependent nations or nations within nations model, but the model looks like this, that there's federal, state forms of government, and then there's regional autonomy. So there's two models of regional autonomy in the formal legal structure. One is with single indigenous groups, the Yaqui territory, for example, or the Otomi, for example, Purépecha. Another model is a multi-ethnic autonomous indigenous zone, and that has to do with, like in Chiapas, where people were forcibly enslaved and migrated there for labor. So that's the multi-ethnic indigenous autonomy model. Those are the state practices or statecraft around indigenous autonomy projects. But there's also other forms of autonomy, which is best well known as the Zapatista vision of autonomy, which is also a form of indigenous autonomy. And by that they mean autonomous from the state, right? Autonomous from the state. So education, their own schools, like that. So in general, indigenous autonomy as a legal or juridical claim has the right to be a people, the right to land and protection of territory, the right to self-determination, cultural forms, knowledge and language, indigenous jurisprudence and law, and the right to cosmovision, right? Cosmovisión, as we say in Spanish. So that's an interesting worldview, your relation to nature. And so that's leading to all different kinds of rights. Like I mentioned in Bolivia, where they had the counter summit to the World Environmental Summit, UN World Environmental Summit, and they came up with the right of Mother Earth, the right of the earth. And then there's another kind of autonomy, which is the forms of autonomy that indigenous women activists are elaborating, that takes those other legal forms, legal categories, and applies them in kind of interesting and unexpected ways. And they've come up with bodily autonomy, autonomy around cultural knowledge and medicinal knowledge. So they're confronting biopiracy of seeds and challenging Monsanto and these corporate globalizations around seed, and that is their traditional knowledge, right? How to plant and grow seeds. And we know corn is a major issue in Mexico. So that's kind of, there's multiple autonomies, I guess, like multiple sovereignties going on, but they do intersect well with the notion of self-determination.
Well, I'll invite another connected.
Well, definitely highlight for.
Okay, may I just,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay, I just want to ask you something. If autonomy connotes, I still have my zone of separateness, though connected to you. I think that sounds like what the women in Mexico are talking about. There was consultation, there was the connection, that's the consult, and then here's where we women want our space. I think that would, I don't see that as problematic at all. The problem with this international law is that often in the scholarship, autonomy is viewed as a devolution of power from the sovereignty down. And I think that is something that, clearly in the Hawaii case, they love the U.S. proponents love the words self-governance and autonomy, and I consider them dangerous in that case because they mean it in that way, okay? And then secondly, rather than view the state as layered, I think that what was novel about the UNDRIP is that it was trying to suggest a structure of partnership so that it's really like this, a little bit more like European Union, you might say, than layered. Okay, so I just want to put that out.
Another common theme that emerged, at least to my ear, that sort of underlies some of the other presentations, but since we have a sort of internationally interested panel today, is the question of Israel-Palestine, which was sort of connected to Professor Goldberg's comments, but also then Professor Volpp, and I think actually Michael Walzer very much had Israel-Palestine in mind in spheres of justice. I think that's exactly what he was thinking of. So I just wondered whether you might want to, either of you or anybody else on the panel, think about or comment on the ways in which alternative models of resistance are being formulated, whether through nonviolent praxis, other forms of agency, et cetera, trying to assert ideas of sovereignty that nonetheless connect to a binational project, so not necessarily a secessionist project, but an alternative sort of paradigm of what political community might look like in that context, and whether that represents something of interest potentially as an international model, or any other comment you might have on that context. And it also connects in some ways to Professor Gott's presentation insofar as, Professor Goldberg, again in your own work, you've looked at racial Palestinianization and the connection of the Palestine paradigm with the ways in which communities, Muslim American, South Asian, Middle Eastern, and so forth, domestically are being racialized and are being subjected to these assertions of national security-based sovereignty prerogatives. So I wonder if there might be connected themes there in some of your presentations.
Just to get this going, I was going to pick up on the comments you made about Walzer. I mean, it struck me as you were talking. I mean, I think he clearly was trying to reconcile his position on Israel, Palestine, with his liberalism, right? And I mean that quite seriously. And the finding of another site for aliens who don't quite belong here, so became his mode out. I mean, the way in which this implodes, of course, is once you, and I think you were hinting at this, once you characterize a people as alien, sovereignty, in a sense, extends alienage to them wherever they are, right? They can't possibly belong, right, anywhere once you get rid of them from the space to which they take themselves to belong. I mean, they're alien wherever they go. So the very definition of alienation, right, in all its senses, becomes a way of extending that alienation to them, and in a way, it's extending sovereignty beyond its borderlines, so to speak. You know, of course, Palestinians, wherever they are, and maybe non-Israelis, just to put it in those terms, who are characterized in their nonage, so to speak, to use John Stuart Mill's term, wherever they are, assert themselves. I mean, as say Hizbollah has, right, as saying you have to deal with us, right? We will leave you alone if you leave us alone, but if you don't leave us alone, we will respond to you in just the way you've responded to us. I mean, what was remarkable about Hizbollah, and we visited both South Beirut and had a tour, I'm not sure I should say this in public, but we were given a tour of this reconstruction area by the Hizbollah head of the reconstruction agency. And then we spent a day on the southern border, including the Hizbollah War Memorial. And what was interesting about the Hizbollah, especially the Hizbollah War Memorial, is that it's a flip of Israeli war memorials. I mean, it's a mirror image. It's quite remarkable in its architecture, in its representation, in its characterization of itself, in its standing up for what it is, in its refusal of invasion, and so on and so forth. I mean, and so those notions of sovereignty then get extended, right, and taken up, but given twists, you might say. What was interesting about and there are a range of spaces. I mean, on the border, there were these spaces. There's a village that is populated by Syrian migrant workers. That is a Lebanese village. I mean, it's the southern corner, right, of Lebanon, in what historically was Lebanon. A Lebanese village populated by Syrian migrant workers. The UN, UNIFIL, has drawn the blue line right down the middle of the village and given one side to Israel and the other side to Lebanon. Israel then occupied the whole village because it wanted to guarantee its access to the Golan Heights, where it has sites of surveillance. And it's has been the center of the narcotics trade from Lebanon through the Syrian migrant workers into Israel. Right? I mean, there's no law. I mean, it's overregulated by law, and law doesn't apply. I mean, it's deregulated regulation and irregular regularity. I mean, it's just outside I mean, it's what we want to call, what I want to call bent space. I mean, there are just no categories to which. It's why I said we're phenomenologically screwed in the end. There are no terms which settle on it, so to speak, because it's unsettled. And in its unsettlement, it's completely settled.
No, go ahead.
So I guess part of the way I enter in this is thinking about immigration and citizenship and the Arendtian, the right to have the rights, which I think you've referred to as membership. Other people talk about, did she mean some kind of national citizenship, thinking about what happened following World War II and the incredible precariousness of being stateless. But just to note, I think Israel recently has said they're going to make it more difficult, more easy for Israeli Arabs, I think, to lose their citizenship. I don't know if people know about this, but this is going on everywhere. This happened already in Great Britain. This was proposed in the United States in terms of national security rationales for divesting people of citizenship. At the same time, there are lots of people that say, well, citizenship isn't necessarily what grounds the right to have rights, that we should think about such things as alien citizenship, that aliens have certain kinds of rights that are respected and recognized, at least in the United States context, and that it's too reductive to sort of think of aliens as having no rights and citizenship as having rights, although, of course, perhaps the most foundational right being the right to not be deported is one that only citizens have. Although at the same time we have to recognize the possibility for naturalized citizens of denaturalization and the ways that this have happened for various non-citizens who have become national security threats, where the U.S. government starts to investigate, well, how did this person naturalize? How did they initially get their legal permanent residency status? Oh, there's something fraudulent in there where we can undo the whole thing? As well as the presumption that citizens can freely return to their country, which has also been halted in the national security context for U.S. citizens. So I'd say that. And then I guess in terms of thinking about the question of resistance, I'm thinking less about the question of a binational Israeli-Palestine project, but about the United States-Mexico, and specifically thinking about, the fascinating coming out of DREAM Act students. And Kevin Escudero, who's here in the audience, is a graduate studying ethnic studies at Berkeley who's studying this phenomenon. And I think it's something that's really interesting to think about. What does this mean? How do we understand this decision by these young people to basically announce their presence, right? They're not supposed to exist, and they're saying, I am here, right, as a form of resistance, which thankfully, for the moment, the Obama administration has chosen actually not to deport any of the potentially DREAM-eligible students, even while the DREAM Act is no dream. It's failed, at least for the next couple of years. But there's also, I think, really interesting questions around sanctuary, sanctuary that people have taken in churches in both the United States and Canada, sort of harking back to an archaic sense of another sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Think of the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and I can't remember her name, the woman, and she's like, sanctuary, sanctuary, on the steps of Notre Dame. Right, so the church is a separate sovereign, and right, people turning to that, and then also thinking about what people have been saying, the sense of the sovereign having the ability to decide who lives and who dies. People intervening in that sense, not so much about facilitating what gets called alien smuggling, and of course Audra has also written about this, but facilitating life for people who are actually trying to cross the border. So intervening in the sovereign's attempt to kill by providing water. And this specifically surfaced recently because there was a Ninth Circuit decision where this guy was charged with littering. And they said, well, actually leaving water bottles for human consumption doesn't fit the definition of littering, so we will not let this conviction stand. But there are communities of conscience and faith who basically go in the Arizona desert, and there's spring breaks that students, or many people who volunteer and do this, and basically under very difficult conditions try to intervene in this way.
So we're open for questions from the floor. Yes.
So I guess I have a question for Gil.
Yep.
The very end of your talk, you spoke about what sounded like a pragmatic defense of sovereignty under some circumstances, and I just thought it'd be interesting for you to elaborate on that. That's what immediately comes to mind is the ways in which various post-colonial states, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, think of sovereignty under the Westphalian model. It its premise that there's a formal equality between states as a kind of guard that can actually be a basis, even if it's not a large standing independent legal principle, it can be a basis for maintaining internal projects of self-determination that are quite varied, and that in effect the language of sovereignty can be a tool to disrupt the ways in which sovereignty has been imposed as a form of imperial extension from the West. And so I was curious if that's what you mean by pragmatic defense of sovereignty. How would it play out in contemporary politics? How does it operate in the context of various forms of intervention that we might see today?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when you read through the critics of, for example, Judith Butler's work or Wendy Brown's work or Zizek's work, where they are critical of the Human Rights Project or rights projects generally, and sort of as a flip side of the challenge of sovereignty that I was talking about in my paper, they're very keen to, I think, immediately always pull back from a full categorical, rejection of it. And I think that, I don't know why they are afraid of that so much, or tend not, to be as robust in that rejection as some of I think the PR around what their interventions suggests, and Zizek publishes something called Against Human Rights, in which he actually at the end embraces some forms of human rights. And I think generally what they look at is the tie-in to social movement mobilization and sort of collective subject formation and mobilization around those transgressive identities. And the template for it is often the civil rights movement in the United States and the formation of black subjectivity, for example, or black nationalist subjectivity. And so I don't think there's a categorical rejection that comes from even these most extreme forms. Even China Miéville's Marxist critique doesn't go that far, I don't think. And so, I think if you wanted to, pursue a kind of a Marxist framework for looking at it, for example, you could say, within this system that's highly flawed, this modality that's highly flawed, and ultimately is in danger of tipping toward opening yourselves up to access to the monster that was talked about, right? Opening yourself up to foreign capital, opening yourself up to, a UN system that doesn't always generate great, political outcomes, and in fact, much of the multilateral intervention that we could talk about in Haiti, for example, in Libya right now, ends up being a really double-edged sword and troubling, right? So all of the opening up toward those kinds of global, really fraudulent universalist kinds of notions of markets and democracies and freedom, that all has to be, thought of in a Marxist framework as possible churning toward ultimately the breaking of the fetters, as Marx, wrote about, right? And so if you want to draw a parallel in that sense, even a Marxist like Miéville, I think, backs away ultimately from saying that these might be useful steps toward an ultimate transformation of a system that is ultimately a monster that's in the mode of creating disorder everywhere it goes and melting down everywhere it goes, and seems to be on an ineluctable path toward that kind of destruction. If you take the Arab uprisings, they are very much nationalist uprisings. They're very much in the mode of traditional sovereign discourse in that sense, traditional self-determination. But they're also full-on rejections, I think, at least they start out that way, full-on rejections of globalization. They're full-on rejections of the globalization that those people have had to accept, which is the globalization, the form of living under a client state of the a U.S. client state that's despotic. So I think again they are. That's why I'm drawing on that Wallerstein's notion of what the left should be doing is not arguing about what the best long-term outcome is, and saying, oh well, you're a reformist or you're a revolutionary, and if you're one you can't talk to the other, but rather to say in the long term, yeah, this monster needs to be dealt with. And we shouldn't kid ourselves of opening ourselves up, by becoming full-fledged members of whatever, system it is that is purporting this kind of universalist purchase over us. We shouldn't kid ourselves about that. But in the short term or the midterm, these may be the exact steps we have to take toward altering the conditions on the ground that will bring about some transformation. And so we shouldn't be neurotically projecting forward into some long-term stupid debate about, are you a revolutionary or are you a reformist?
I'm just going to interject one point on that, which is on the Arab uprisings. Another thing that's interesting, although it's true that they're taking place within certain borders and thereby reinscribing certain conceptions of sovereignty, it's also the first time in at least a generation, if not more, that you see a transnational conception of solidarity in the Arab world around the category Arab. But anyway, you had a question, yes, go ahead.
I wanted to ask Leti Volpp about the relationship between immigration and settler colonialism that your paper, your presentation was outlining for us. And I think that it's one thing to say that U.S. immigration law presumes the sovereignty of the United States to let people in and reside here, or increasingly to try and pretend that they're not letting them in and just classify them as illegal. But I think that there's a distinction between that and saying that what migrants are doing is presuming that they are going to come and become settler colonists in the United States. And I'm concerned because there seems to have been, in the last 20 or so years, an expansion of this category of settler colonists to go beyond its kind of historical specificity to mean all migrants, so that if you leave somewhere and you move somewhere else, just through that very act alone, you have colonized somebody, and you are therefore a settler colonist. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how practices of sovereignty, and in particular national forms of sovereignty, regulate migration in a particular way that, rather than seeing them as the migrants are the colonizers, as that this global system of national sovereignty is actually perpetuating particular sets of social relationships of imperialism and global capitalism. Because the migrant is a particular category, and we shouldn't confuse them with actual human beings who move around the world, right? If being a migrant is being the subject of national state sovereignty, right? And if migrant, as you mentioned, is the ultimate body of expellability. You can expel the migrant from society because the society has been defined as national. I'm wondering if you can extend your talk a little bit more so that we're not left in this notion that the world is a static place, that people never move, and if they do move, we can easily classify them as colonizers.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. And actually, just empirically, in terms of the world never moves, there's actually a stunning statistic, which is that only 3% of the world's population lives outside its country of origin. And because we're in immigration, anybody from Canada, Australia, the U.S., that feels like a very strange thing, because statistically we live in countries of vastly greater migration. But I guess I'm interested, I'm not interested in, it sort of reminds me a little bit of the discussion on the previous panel in terms of are we, the non-Indigenous, all settlers who are here? And, interesting questions around morality, complicity, it's an unsettling thing to feel, but I think it's an important thing to, think about it and decide how one feels about it. And I think, there's a way in which, I think in particular, I come to this out of Asian American studies. There's a kind of desire for people to recognize the racial injustice wreaked, on Asian immigrants to the United States, Asian Americans, how this community was formed absolutely through these triple bars of exclusion of alien land laws, racial ineligible to become a citizen, and immigration exclusion. And you have this, constitution of the so-called alien citizen, the person that can never be a citizen. And so there's a status of being victimized, right, by state practices, which makes it, I think, difficult to see how one enters in projects of subordination where one is not a victim of that project. So I think it's important to think about those complicated relationships. At the same time, I was really avidly reading Aziz Rana's book this past week and thinking about, I'm not saying that all migrants inherited this DNA idea of settler colonialism, that the inheritors of this are the sons of Norway, the sons of Germany, the sons, whatever. Those are the ones who are seen as the immediate heirs to the forefathers who have the easy assimilability. I mean, we've got such messed up immigration laws or something that I even won't get into in terms of not an explicit racial bar, it's actually a formal racial equality program, which means that this nation of immigrants narrative, my ancestors immigrated lawfully, why can't you, which is used to condemn present-day undocumented immigrants, has everything to do with a formally equal per-country quota system of immigration where Mexico gets the same number of people that can come in lawfully as Bhutan or Fiji. And it's a ridiculous and very unjust system. So I don't think that the heirs to settler colonialism in the sense that I was talking about of the person who is the lawful immigrant with the easy track to assimilation and incorporation into this mythic full civic inclusion is anybody but the European American or the white American. But I'm actually eager to talk more with Aziz about the temporal nature of this, right? The precise relationship of the settler colonial project, the immigration project, and what that means in terms of how we think about this. I'm very eager to talk to you too.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking our panelists.